presentation, I'm only going to focus on Canada and the United States. For the past 15 years, I have compiled studies and statistics on the military's impacts on the climate and the natural environment. And over the same period, I have also closely followed the negotiations of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In 2014, I was asked by the International Peace Bureau to prepare a report entitled Demilitarization for Deep Decarbonization, about the need to reduce militarism and military spending to tackle the climate crisis. In my presentation, I will discuss some of the important findings from the latest assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I believe that science needs to frame the policy choices that we make for the climate, for security, and for peace. Then I will look more closely at military emissions and military spending and the United Nations initiative on the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project. And I will conclude with some recommendations and some questions that require further investigation. This is a picture of the refueling of a CF-18 fighter jet. All fighter jets, Canadian fighter jets included, require a specialized fuel called JP-8 that is more carbon intensive and more refined with extra toxic additives than the fuel used by commercial aircraft. Each CF-18 consumes 4,400 liters of fuel per hour and requires the maintenance and engineering costs of more than $17,000 per year. A U.S. Air Force study calculated that the fully burdened cost for aerial refueling is $35 to $40 a gallon. So for the fuel alone, it's $1,000 per hour. And these are the fighter jets that Canada used for its airstrikes over Syria and Iraq. According to the Department of National Defence in Canada, the CF-18s conducted 1,378 airstrikes, bombing missions between October 2014 and February 2016. But over this period and until today, the Canadian Polaris air refuelers have delivered 32 million pounds of fuel to coalition forces. Though Canada has stopped its bombing, it continues to literally fuel the conflict. In total, according to U.S. Central Command, there have been almost 15,700 airstrikes in these countries since August of 2014 as part of Operation Inherent Resolve. That's 605 airstrikes over Syria and Iraq every single month for the past 25 months. So imagine for a moment the amount of fuel consumed, the cost of that fuel, and the greenhouse gases emitted. Canada and the United States that are involved in this bombing campaign are not accounting for the climate impacts, let alone the civilian impacts of these airstrikes. Let's consider for a moment then the military emissions and expenditures in the context of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 5th assessment report. The latest assessment report, released in 2014, explains that humanity is on, as Laura explained, the business as usual path, continuing to increase greenhouse gases year after year. The scientists warned that the path that we are on will increase the likelihood of severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts. To change course, the international community must stay within a carbon budget of 825 gigatons of CO2 over the next 34 years and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. This requires 80 to 90% of the fossil fuel reserves to be left in the ground, and countries must begin, quote, a rapid and radical decarbonization of their economies. This is the IPCC graph of the modeling based on the business as usual or worst case scenario. And it's shown in the top black line. It's called RCP 8.5, Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5. At our current rate of carbon emissions, we are heading towards 1,000 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, an increase to at least 4 degrees in the global mean temperature by 2100, and it's potentially catastrophic for all life on Earth, as Laura explained as well. We have already broken the threshold of 400 parts per million, and at this rate, we are already experiencing extreme forest fires, flooding, droughts, and heat waves across the globe. So, to get off this path, the United Nations launched the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project. Technical and scientific experts have been brought together to help countries find zero carbon emission pathways to stay within this carbon budget to 2050. So plans have been created for all the major emitting countries like Canada, the United States, India, the UK, and the project describes deep decarbonization as a profound transformation of energy systems through steep declines in carbon intensity in all sectors of the economy. Every sector is examined but the military. Yet the military sector is one of the largest consumers of fossil fuels in the economy. This is Canada's Deep Decarbonization Pathways plan. Military is not included, but the Department of National Defense is the largest consumer of fossil fuels among all federal agencies in this country. Let's look more closely at the problem of military emissions. In congressional reports and testimony, it is well acknowledged that the U.S. Department of Defense is the largest institutional consumer of oil in the world, spending $17 billion a year. It is also the largest landholder on the planet, with a global real property portfolio that consists of 562,000 installations, covering 25 million acres. And of the petroleum products that the U.S. military uses, 25% is for stationary installations and 75% is used for mobile operations. Military vehicles like tanks, fighter jets, warships are notoriously energy inefficient and have long life cycles with locked-in energy platforms that are very difficult to alter. The military is concerned about the costs of its fuel, its own energy security, the impacts of the climate on its installations, and the threat multiplier effect of climate change, but it is not concerned about its responsibility to the climate crisis. So let's look at how military emissions are accounted for or not by the IPCC and the UN. The IPCC established guidelines for countries in the preparation of their greenhouse gas inventories and their common reports. These reports have to be submitted to the Secretariat every year. And these are publicly available. You can go and look at your own national reports on the IPCC website. Yet how military emissions are accounted for remains incomplete and opaque. There are specific clauses for confidentiality, exemptions, and allowances for aggregation. Here are two examples. Quote, due to confidentiality issues, many inventory compilers may have difficulty obtaining data for the quantity of fuel used by the military. And a minimum level of aggregation may be required to protect confidential business and military information. According to the latest report on U.S. emissions of greenhouse gases, it states, emissions from military bunker fuels are subtracted from the U.S. total. They are exempt and off the books. So why does the military get this special treatment? Well, the former U.S. Undersecretary and lead negotiator of the American delegation at the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, Stuart Eizenstat, he said in a Senate hearing in 1998, quote, we took special pains working with the Defense Department and with our uniformed military, both before and in Kyoto, to fully protect the unique position of the United States as the world's only superpower with global military responsibilities. We achieved everything they outlined as necessary to protect military operations and our national security. At Kyoto, the parties, for example, took a decision to exempt key overseas military activities from any emissions targets, including exemptions for bunker fuels used in international aviation and maritime transport, and from emissions resulting from multilateral operations. So now the militaries of every single country can take advantage of these exemptions. And the climate agreement at Paris does nothing to rectify this. Military emissions were not discussed and are not included in the final agreement. Mitigating climate change is not a priority for the American and Canadian militaries. This is evident if we look at defense policies. This is the latest annual report of the Canadian Department of National Defense. It's about 200 pages long. Looking at the top security issues from Canada, the words climate change do not even appear in the text. This spring, the federal government launched the Defense Policy Review. In that document, there is no discussion of climate change. By contrast, the US military does have extensive policy statements on climate change. In the most recent US Quadrennial Defense Review, climate change is mentioned, but not because the DoD wants to reduce its greenhouse gases. The DoD states climate change may increase the frequency, scale, and complexity of future missions. So from the Pentagon's perspective, climate change justifies its continued existence. From studying American military policies and reports, it is clear to me that the Pentagon is trying to reduce its fuel consumption and costs, but not because it's concerned about climate change. It is concerned about maintaining its operational tempo. And this is further evidenced by the US Defense Sciences Board 2008 report entitled More Fight, Less Fuel, and by the Pentagon's first operational energy strategy entitled Energy for the Warfighter, released in 2011. The department is trying to make warfighting more energy efficient. This is the Pentagon's latest operational energy strategy that was released this spring, and it concludes that it needs a robust energy strategy to increase future warfighting capabilities. And most recently, the U.S. Defense Logistics Agency, which is the agency that buys the fuel for the military, it projects a continued and steady increase in the use of petroleum products by the military over the next 2 decades. So it's going to be fossil fuel gluttony for the military, but it's going to be energy austerity for all of us. Let's turn our attention now to public spending and climate financing for a moment. To tackle the climate crisis, we need to spend a lot of money to make the transition to a zero-carbon economy. The International Energy Agency estimates that $1 trillion is needed annually to decarbonize. The UN Green Climate Fund needs $100 billion every single year to help developing countries adapt to climate change, to the problems that we've created. The UN also estimates that it will require $3 to $5 trillion every year to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. This is a very ambitious agenda. So we're very concerned that Canada and the United States, the countries that are wealthy, Western countries with well-financed armies, why aren't they adequately funding the UN Green Climate Fund? Why aren't they putting adequate financial resources to tackle the greatest human security challenge that we're all facing, climate change? Where are they spending our tax dollars? So according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, in its April report, the global annual military spending has increased to $1.7 trillion, and there's increased and intense pressure from NATO on countries to spend 2% of their GDP on the military. And June, when President Obama came to Ottawa and was speaking in the House of Commons, what was his key message? In his speech, he said NATO 3 times, and he said, NATO needs more Canada. NATO needs more Canada. He was asking us to increase our military spending. That's what Obama's message was to our country. And every single MP in the House of Commons was on their feet clapping. This is CIPRI's graph of global military spending over the past 30 years, averaging over $1 trillion. And of course, this is CIPRI's ranking of highest military spenders. The United States is first, right, at approximately $60 billion. Canada is not on this chart, but it's ranked 16th in the world for military spending with $23 billion annually. Most of you already know this, but what you might not know is that The U.S. Department of Defense has not been audited in more than 20 years. The Government Accountability Office has not been able to look at the Pentagon's books and has kept the department on its high-risk list. This is the biennial report that the GAO submits every year, and it says that the department is at a high risk for fraud, waste, and financial abuse. Now, this makes circumspect for me all Department of Defense reporting, even on its fuel costs and consumption, because there is no independent oversight, there is no transparency of what the Pentagon is doing. I suspect things are much worse than they appear. Let's compare U.S. military spending on defense and on, let's compare U.S. federal spending on defense versus the environment. So this is from Table 4.1, outlays by agency from the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. The Environmental Protection Agency gets $9 billion. The Department of Energy, which is responsible for both renewable energy and nuclear weapons, gets $23 billion. And the Department of Defense gets approximately $600 billion. So in Canada, if you want to find out information about the federal spending, you go to the public accounts. Do you think the graph is similar in Canada? Well, it is. The Canadian government spends $1.5 billion on Environment and Climate Change Canada, and the Department of Defense, of course, gets $23 billion. I threw in overseas development assistance. You can see the humanitarian crisis that the world is facing. Canada contributes a measly $1.8 billion. And these are audited figures from the public accounts. But it's really important to see to consider public spending over time. So I went back through the National Archives of the Public Accounts, and I put in the figures. So this is, the red line is military spending over the past 20 years, in 1997, going from $8 billion to $23 billion currently. And the federal environmental spending has flatlined over the last 20 years at approximately $1 billion, even though we know that the environmental crisis is getting much, much worse. So why is there a prioritizing of military security and military spending over environmental security? Based on the science of climate change and mitigation, the climate mitigation and adaptation, I argue that there absolutely has to be a parallel process of demilitarization and disarmament alongside. Western countries, especially the US, the UK, and Canada, must take a lead in reducing militarism and military spending if we want to have any hope in achieving our sustainable development goals and averting a climate catastrophe. And I also believe we need to consider some fundamental questions. How much of this precious carbon budget of 825 gigatons of CO2 are we going to allocate to the military? And for what purposes? For warfighting? Why are military missions not on the COP agenda? And why are military expenditures not considered as a source for climate financing? Why is there limited independent scientific and scholarly research on the military's impacts on the climate and the environment? And finally, what are the peaceful alternatives that we can put forward to achieve climate justice and protect the environment? And in closing, I would like to share with you the final declaration. It was a very powerful, bold statement that was made at the Paris meeting, the climate meeting in Paris last November. The Indigenous Environmental Network was part of a delegation called It Takes Roots. And the statement that they publicly released is really incredible, and it gives me a lot of hope. It's called No War, No Warming. Build an economy for people and the planet. And this is from their declaration. We are calling on world leaders to move towards inclusion over exclusion, renewable energy over pollution, profiteering, cutting emissions at source over carbon trading and offset regimes, and peace over militarism. This is what the delegation said to world leaders, and we need to listen. Thank you.